First, the lower and lower prices of industrial products brought about by machine labor totally destroyed in all countries of the world the old system of manufacture or industry based upon hand labor. In this way, all semi-barbarian countries, which had hitherto been more or less strangers to historical development, and whose industry had been based on manufacture, were violently forced out of their isolation. They bought the cheaper commodities of the English and allowed their own manufacturing workers to be ruined. Countries which had known no progress for thousands of years, for example India, were thoroughly revolutionized, and even China is now on the way to a revolution. We have come to the point where a new machine invented in England deprives millions of Chinese workers of their livelihood within a year's time. In this way, big industry has brought all the people of the earth into contact with each other, has merged all local markets into one world market, has spread civilization and progress everywhere, and has thus ensured that whatever happens in civilized countries will have repercussions in all other countries. It follows that if the workers in England or France now liberate themselves, this must set off revolution in all other countries, revolutions which, sooner or later, must accomplish the liberation of their respective working class. Second, wherever big industries displaced manufacture, the bourgeoisie developed in wealth and power to the utmost and made itself the first class of the country. The result was that wherever this happened, the bourgeoisie took political power into its own hands and displaced the hitherto ruling class, the aristocracy, the guild masters, and their representative, the absolute monarchy. The bourgeois annihilated the power of the aristocracy, the nobility, by abolishing the entailment of estates, in other words, by making landed property subject to purchase and sale, and by doing away with the special privileges of the nobility. It destroyed the power of the guild masters by abolishing guilds and handicraft privileges. In their place, it put competition, that is, a state of society in which everyone has the right to enter into any branch of industry, the only obstacle being a lack of the necessary capital. The introduction of free capital is thus public declaration that from now on the members of society are unequal only to the extent that their capitals are unequal, that capital is the decisive power, and that therefore the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, have become the first class in society. Free competition is necessary for the establishment of big industry, because it is the only condition of society in which big industry can make its way. Having destroyed the social power of the nobility and the guild masters, the bourgeois also destroyed their political power. Having raised itself to the actual position of first class in society, it proclaims itself to be also the dominant political class. This it does through the introduction of the representative system, which rests on bourgeois equality before the law and the recognition of free competition, and in European countries takes the form of constitutional monarchy. In these constitutional monarchies, only those who possess a certain capital are voters, that is to say, only members of the bourgeois. These bourgeois voters choose the deputies, and these bourgeois deputies, by using their right to refuse to vote taxes, choose a bourgeois government. Third, everywhere the proletariat develops in step with the bourgeoisie, in proportion as the bourgeoisie grows in wealth, the proletariat grows in numbers. For, since the proletarians can be employed only by capital, and since capital extends only through employed labor, it follows that the growth of the proletariat proceeds at precisely the same pace as the growth of capital. Simultaneously, this process draws members of the bourgeoisie and proletarians together into the great cities where industry can be carried on most profitably, and by thus throwing great masses in one spot, it gives to the proletarians a consciousness of their own strength. Moreover, the further this process advances, the more new labor-saving machines are invented. the greater is the pressure exercised by big industry on wages, which, as we have seen, sink to their minimum and therewith render the condition of the proletariat increasingly unbearable. The growing dissatisfaction of the proletariat thus joins with its rising power to prepare a proletarian social revolution. This is the first lengthy section we've seen in quite a while, so let's break it down by its following subsections. Subsection 1. Trade and the supersession of mercantile economies. It's clear in this subsection that when a country is exposed to the commodities of Western and imperialist powers, that it clearly comes in mass quantities and is way cheaper than the homeland's products. Yet, what does that clearly mean in terms of the relationship between the two? It means for the Western imperialist power that it has expanded into a new market to keep capitalism's decay at bay. For the correlative nation, it means that they supersede the current economy with the presence of a more advanced economy that they face at the current situation, of the amount of products that is flowing into their nation, whether it be freely emitted into their nation or not. But yet, there is this ambiguous case that they will face a subordination to the imperialist power instead. And this subordination acts as a medium for imperialism to come in and struggle with the existing forces of production and twist them to serve the colonial overlord's needs. But this very process also speeds up the dialectic in these areas until it hits arbitrary limits that the imperialist powers set up in place to make it so that the imperialist powers can extract financial capital or finance capital from the colonies and make them weaker than the master always. But in a twist of irony, this antagonistic contradiction of stubborn arbitrariness will be overcome in a revolution. But in a bourgeois matter, for feudal social orders have long been superseded. Subsection 2. Unemployment and unity. Truly, when socioeconomic progress is forced into so fast a motion and is enforced by a dialectically higher power, there will be unforeseen consequences to this whole movement that's happening in the subordinate country, or the country that's under imperialism. In cases like China back then, where Britain had technology so advanced to Chinese technology, it made a massive setback to the manufacturing inside of China that it deprived manufacturers of their existing jobs. They couldn't face the economic competition set by Britain, which was one-sided to their advantage nonetheless, not only economically, but was militarily enforced by Britain, and this had made the economy subsequently faltered and subordinate to the British economy, as well as the other economies that were present there, like the French and the German, and later the Japanese economy. Regardless of all such, the will of capital then incorporated the previously stubborn and rebellious Chinese economy to the bourgeois world economy, while getting out any element that presents a threat to the bourgeois world spirit. If it, and many others like it, couldn't subordinate itself to the will of capital, then the countries protecting such will were set into motion to crush such rebellious spirits. Otherwise, for when those weren't in rebellion, they would be subjected to the chaos of the marketplace with no stops, and be forced to progress in order to numb up the pain. Yet this unity also enhances the existing bourgeois world spirit, and makes it more whole, but never having been able to be perfect as it had lacked something that wasn't under its will. But destroying this lacking will not make it more perfect. It'll only make it more standardized, and the world would just be under the will of capital, and thusly it will create more obstacles and newer obstacles that it had previously not foreseen. And in these unforeseen consequences, it will spell out its very own doom. Subsection 3. Revolutionary Spirit. Yet, in this movement to force the world to be bourgeois, the march of history hasn't yet reached its ending point, but taken a decisive step towards such, regardless. In this, now the relations of the mercantile feudal social order are damned, and a bourgeois one is in its place. Thusly, if a workers' revolution were to be kicked off in the first world, then it will follow suit to the third world, as the personal and political power of capital has been shattered and thus can be superseded. Yet this can only be taken as a hypothetical in the universal sense that each particular stickling it out will tell a different story of their revolution, as one's in the first world is solely between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, as the two main and primary antagonistic forces that fight off of each other. This is true in the third world as well, which, remind you, the third world is subordinated to the first world through the medium of imperialism, which that medium had moved past the medium of subordination as to carry out the whims of the first world. In any case, the working class of the third world do face off the first world bourgeois. However, it also faces another competitor. It's the comprador class that enforces the whims of the first world bourgeois. However, for the part of the natural bourgeoisie of the third world that there is to be in defiance of the first world bourgeois, they often work with the third world pro to overcome the comprador class and any remnant of the first world bourgeois in their country. Yet this sets up the condition where it's highly similar to the first world pro and the first world bourgeois struggle, even when the contingencies are factored in. However, with the primary contradictions being the third world to the first world, that struggle needs to be overcome first in order for the secondary contradiction to become a primary contradiction, that being what I've literally just stated, between pro and bourgeoisie. For if imperialism were to stay in the area, then it will make it impossible for the secondary contradiction to be overcome. However, more on Mao's primary and secondary contradiction later on throughout this entire project. Nevertheless, this universal statement of chain revolutions does have a degree of truth, as revolutionary spirit doesn't metaphysically isolate itself to one spot, but spreads. However, it does equally allow itself to be suppressed if the movement fails to gain enough momentum in any country that it finds itself in. In that meantime of abolishing the old order, it seeks to disrupt the existing social order it finds itself in, and make itself for itself a more revolutionary spirit, as the antagonistic contradictions once again builds up the force of the antithesis, the workers' revolt, and the setup of the dictatorship of the proletariat that will challenge the thesis, the bourgeois class, that accumulates capital at the expense of the proles, and the continued exploitation of the proletariat. Subsection 4. The bourgeois supersession of existing/old ruling classes. This subsection highlights the dialectical spirit of change when given the opportunity to do so, as the dialectics isn't a linear process but more of a helical process, and do not need to reverberate on such. To get back on track, as something that is more dialectical approaches something less dialectically advanced, the more incorporates the less and forces the less to be on par with the more, but it never genuinely can be done on the side of the more. It must be done on both sides through the medium that they interact within each other. For the less will have to consent to the more and even work with the more's given materials to supersede itself to be more than what it was. Else, it remains in stagnation and can get vampirically destroyed by the more once the more realizes that it is something it can exploit to sustain its growth and its being as is at the cost of the less. Concretely, the bourgeoisie, whenever it converts an area to its favor and for its own domination of such areas, it must root out the old that persists and stubbornly refuses to let the new in. In this way, an antagonistic contradiction is created even before the old and new meet each other, but is only realized when these two come into conflict, in terms of only the ruling classes, for the conflict is rather a short one, and will mostly result in the favor of the bourgeoisie, as the bourgeoisie has the means to socio-economically transform the areas to their advantage. The usage of political power and political capital, and regular capital for that matter as well, is transformed into agents that seek to abolish the old social order and to build up the new social order. For the aristocracy's power was annihilated by the bourgeoisie making available the purchase and sale of landed property. For now, the privileges can even be attained by, and will eventually come only to be accessible through the means of capital. This shift of medium from purely political to a purely economic one represents again that the dialectic has both a negative and positive side to its supersession, for this act reproduced the bourgeoisie, but in exchange for the aristocracy being negated out of existence, or large sums of them in any case. Then there's the guild masters that got annihilated by the bourgeois competition system, which came from the negation of guilds and handicraft privileges. For the guild masters' entire relations of production, along with their means of production and forces of production, were gone with it as well, and were transferred to the bourgeoisie. Competition, free competition, only secured the bourgeois existence in these areas and guaranteed and granted the conditions for the free flow of labor and capital, along with the reserve army of labor with it. The latter that will come up very much in Marx's works due to how important it is for any analysis of any economy in any society. To get on the topic of competition, for the security that it brings to the bourgeoisie, it makes insecure the position of the proles. This goes back to the entire argument of the existences of and the security for such existence, that being the ability to work and to not die. For now, an inequality is present where the one-sidedness of capital determines who's who in the class hierarchy of society, and who has the means to do what. As the prole has no capital, they must work for the bourgeoisie that has the capital and can only employ them on the amount of capital they possess. Nonetheless, the lack of free competition, that being competition between the bourgeoisie only, that goes untempered by any higher ruling classes above them, because they are realistically the only highest ruling class there is to be. Thusly, there's a lack of free competition in the totality of society, but there is a uniform free competition between the bourgeoisie only. Subsection 5. Bourgeois democracy. As the political power and political capital is established in an area, they are now able to do as they wish with the area and establish any protocols they want in an area to secure their class. The bourgeoisie in our history had contingently set up a type of democracy that it came to benefit only the bourgeoisie, give freedoms only for the bourgeoisie, and had it configured to where it always favored a bourgeois outcome. The signifier of democracy signified a distinctness from feudal rule, as they now had to accept that there were a whole host of them that wished to voice their factionalist opinion amongst the bourgeois class, and work towards a bourgeois culture in defiance of the old feudal mercantile culture, while being the very same class to subordinate anything that wasn't them to accept their rule, their self-determination, and their self-consciousness. Or that is to say, to make them recognize their self-consciousness, as the bourgeoisie doesn't have to recognize their self-consciousness. Subsection 6. Capital and the Pro. As it was stated earlier in the previous subsections, it is wonderfully explained by Paul Kokshat. The employment of pros is based upon the requirement of capital being there to allow pros to work there as such. That is to say, that a pro can only be hired if capital is available for such. Thusly, wages are based upon their abilities to labor, but upon the reproduction of their ability to labor. In such economic reality, wages were never equal, or will be equal, to the worker's labor value, and will always undercut that value. Thusly, wages can be said to be a medium to denote the amount of money that determines if one or a multiplicity of people can acquire what they need to subsist. Thusly, if more capital is generated and accumulated, then more pros are employed, which again signifies dialectically positive supersession of current reality, or the reproduction of the system. Regardless, this reproduction acts as a force to drag society to centralize capital towards industrial centers, that being the urban landscape and the cities, where the bourgeoisie can further reproduce themselves, again this dialectically positive supersession, while the pro can amass a class consciousness of their own that comes into direct conflict with the bourgeois class consciousness. And this is furthered as more labor-saving machines are created to negate existing jobs to increase the reserve army of labor while decreasing the variable capital needed to be expended to wages alone, which in return increases the rate of surplus value that allows this dialectically positive process to continue on till the medium class struggle holds it during a proletarian revolution which was brought about by the force of the antithesis, that being the workers' revolution.